All right, clap if you can hear me. Clap twice. Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael Kinnucan. I'm a member of the Electoral Working Group, and I'm going to be moderating this debate this evening, so I'm just going to very briefly frame the topic since Nathan said most of it, and then lay out the ground rules, and we'll move into the arguments. So I think this is a great evening to have this debate because it's the evening the House passed the tax bill, which leaves me feeling depressed and angry, but also really hungry for power. I think that we as an organization should hope to be in the position to intervene in this kind of reactionary class warfare. And we're not there yet. We're closer than we were a year ago, but we have a long way to go. I think also this debate occurs at a really key moment in the development of our chapter, where a lot of our first year's campaigns are winding down or at an inflection point where we'll be picking a whole bunch of new campaigns, I hope, for the next year. And I just want to briefly say something about the types of campaigns we've engaged in, the types of campaigns many of us hope to see. So most of what we in New York City-DSA have done this year has been electoral campaigns and issue campaigns. So electoral campaigns like Jabari and Elliott Team, and issue campaigns like Right to Know, Bedford Union Armory, Shutdown Rikers, and many others. And in the new year, I think many of us are considering how we might broaden our tactics and move into things like labor organizing, tenant organizing, as well as serve the people, providing services directly to working class constituencies in order to build the organization. So, without further ado, just the ground rules are each of them gets 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and then I will ask questions. They get 4 minutes each to respond. And then 2.5 minutes for closing statements, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We'll have a huge amount of time for Q&A, and I would just ask that everyone be conscious of progressive stack and conscious of how much time and space you're occupying, as always. So without further ado, Emma for the pro serve the people.
Sorry, really quick, do we have a timekeeper? You might sit in here so we can see. No, I can't see.
Mutual aid or serve the people projects are the provision by a political group of goods or services without charge to people without any sort of means testing. When carried out by the left, these programs are usually targeted at gaps in social welfare, such as the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program prior to the national adoption by the federal government of the school breakfast program in 1975. They are usually accompanied by the group's political propaganda and recruitment. With the Black Panthers, they would get the names and addresses of the kids who attended their breakfast, and then follow up with their guardians to ask them to volunteer for the program and then join the party. And to continue this example, today's debate is nothing new. The Black Panther Party split in part because Elridge Cleaver thought the free breakfast program was a distraction, liberal charity, whereas Huey Newton wanted to make it the center of their organizing. Why should DSA do mutual aid? It's not that it's the morally right thing to do, it's that it's one useful tool in a campaign and organization building toolbox. I am interested in using that tool to fight for Medicare for All and any other campaign that DSA takes on. I know some of y'all have probably been told on Twitter or Medium or whatever that there were only two sides to this debate, brake light fixing and versus Medicare for All. But I don't think canvassing for legislation and mutual aid are mutually exclusive. To the contrary, they're mutually reinforcing. Canvassing is a mobilizing tactic. It's a great tool for when you're trying to get as many angry calls to Chuck Schumer as possible. Canvassing, however, is not development. To use some terms coined by Jane McAlevey, canvassing alone is shallow mobilizing rather than the more effective deep organizing. Our goal isn't a petition, We want a mass movement to crush the multi-billion-dollar opposition to single-payer, because that is the only way we will win. Clever white papers won't win this. A march on DC won't win this. We need hundreds of people who live and breathe this campaign every single day. And fortunately for us, there's already a huge population that lives and breathes the problems that would be solved by Medicare for All, which I will tell you about in a second. Mutual aid is a development tactic. It's not good for quick turnarounds on campaign objectives. It can be expensive, or at least more complicated than normal canvassing. But what mutual aid does that canvassing does not is carve out a space for DSA to engage community members on that deep organizing level. And in that space, we can do a lot of great things, but I only have time for 3. Number 1, we can recruit the people we help to volunteer with our campaign and join DSA. Number 2, we can use the stories we hear as advocacy material. And number 3, we create an image of DSA as stepping in where business as usual has failed, which is an ideal causal narrative for our organization. I have yet to see any canvassing campaign that has effectively been used to build membership in an organization. Even if you're happy with our net numbers, and I'm not happy until we hit 30 million, even if you're happy with our net numbers, the demographics of this room show gaps in our recruiting of Central Brooklyn's working class. So recruiting should very much be a priority for us. Centuries of organizations across the political spectrum use mutual aid to recruit mass popular support, from the Black Panther Party to Hezbollah, from the popular health movement in the 1830s to practically every church. So we're New York City Socialist Feminist is going to start a medical debt relief program. The model is simple. We find people who are being sued over medical debt, help them fight this exploitation, and then ask them to join the movement. These are the working class, predominantly people of color I see in the debt collection courts every week. They're angry, they're intimately familiar with the system, and they're desperate for change. We're not going to save them, we're going to train them to fight. And hopefully they'll go on to train others and use their stories to powerfully advocate for single payer. We need to change the causal narrative, both around medical debt and DSA. We need to prove the medical debt is not some irresponsibility on the part of the debtor, that it is what the powerful are doing to us for their own profit, and we need to show that DSA is about action as well as words. As currently stands, people join DSA for their identity. Occupy Wall Street or Bernie Sanders or whatever woke them up to the need for socialism, they signed up with the socialist organization. There's nothing wrong with that. It's why I joined, and as we just heard, it's why Jordan joined, and I hope it continues, but it limits our reach to people who have already made it that far. If we're serious about being a working class movement, we need to get serious about doing mutual aid. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to start off by saying thank you to the organizers of this. This is a debate that has happened informally, online, in similar non-public forums. I think it's really important that we continue to have events like this. So first, I just want to say, even though I'm more critical of Serve the People projects, obviously, DSA isn't the type of organization that can make people engage in a campaign that they don't want to, right? So I'm not going to argue that we should shut down Serve the People programs. I just think we should have a strategic debate about their use and their effectiveness over the long term. And if Serve the People programs are shown to seriously recruit members and build the power of the organization, I will absolutely celebrate the work that people have done. So first, how I define Serve the People programs are direct material aid in the form of goods, that's food or clothing, or services like legal representation, immigration assistance, or tutoring, that are provided in a systematic way by the organization. So the term Serve the People projects, I think, has been used to actually mean 3 different things when we talk about it in DSA. Now the first 2, I'm broadly in favor of, and the third, I'm skeptical of, though I still think that in limited circumstances, they may make sense. So the first way I think that we need Serve the People is in disaster or crisis relief, like DSA chapters were doing in Florida and Texas after the hurricanes. Obviously, we should help out our neighbors or fellow citizens when they're in crisis. There's no reason to think that we shouldn't or that we won't. The question for me then is whether relief efforts like this should be a sustained program or campaign within our organization. I personally think that we should more so be connecting people to organizations and partnering with organizations that have the resources and the experience to provide these types of services. The second thing I think we mean when we talk about serve the people is internal mutual aid amongst organizational members. So that's providing child care, providing housing for traveling comrades, setting up bail funds for direct actions. This is an essential part of building a culture of solidarity within an organization. Obviously, it should continue. The third thing I think we mean is externally oriented service projects. So brake lights, flu shot clinics, tutoring programs. I think this is the one that's most contentious between Emma and I, and most contentious within the organization, and probably where we should spend most of our time talking tonight. Now, among these externally oriented programs, I think there are two arguments that are typically given as to why we should do them. The first is that it allows us to make contact with, build trust with, working class communities, and then mobilize and recruit those people into our organization. The second reason that's given is that it reduces the pain of capitalism right now, right? Providing services that people need day to day. I think both of these are generally misguided or at least have serious shortcomings, and we can address those in the Q&A. So the question then is, what should we do instead for critical of serve the people programs? Simply, I think we should be organizing in communities around political demands with the goal of building a mass base. And I think that the work of the Socialist Feminist Working Group, of which Emma has been the leader, and their campaign for the New York Health Act is a terrific example of this. Canvassing for Jabari and Caterine 18, the Right to Know Act, and the Bedford Union Armory are also great examples, right? These are campaigns in which we articulated our politics to the masses of New York City voters, and we collected information that we can use to do targeted recruitment. All of that said, I can still imagine some specific limited situations in which some versions of what I'm going to call external serve the people projects might be supportive of a larger campaign. So overall, I want to emphasize 3 points tonight, or I'm going to try to emphasize 3 points. The first is that we need to ask ourselves what the goal is of a socialist organization. I think it's to develop consciousness among people to make demands for political and economic justice, demands that are only realizable through class struggle, and to eventually win those demands. And this should entail taking money and power away from the rich and powerful. The second point I want to emphasize is that I actually think Serve the People projects or programs are fine as supplemental projects, but that in and of themselves, they don't build a politics of class struggle. I think we need to be clear in our organizing about who the enemy is and who we're trying to take power away from. It's not entirely clear to me how SDP projects identify the enemy or how they effectively recruit people to fight that enemy. The third point I want to emphasize is that we need to think critically about how we use our time and resources as an organization most effectively. I think we do this by doing mass organizing around political demands that make interventions against capitalist power. If we do this, we can train socialist organizers on campaigns by engaging in collective struggle for material, social, and political power.
One of the most contentious issues between you two seems to be whether Serve the People will serve the goal we all share of building a larger and more diverse DSA. So proponents of Serve the People, if I'm understanding correctly, argue that seeing a socialist organization take direct action to help them will lead them to reconsider their politics and potentially either become socialists, join the organization, whereas opponents might argue that services are great, but they don't change people's political consciousness. I'd be curious to hear each of you say how you see the process of politicization working or not working within Serve the People program.
So, what's the biggest problem with elections? People don't come out and vote. And that is one of the key political problems I see about the current consciousness of the working class, especially if we're pursuing electoral goals and objectives, which I completely support. When we do mutual aid, we're talking to people not just to their ideas and to their sense of politics. People experience the world with their entire bodies. It's not just hearing things, it's not just thinking about ideas, it's their stomach, it's their muscles, it's all of these different parts of their body. And these sensory experiences hide in your memory. I think we can all remember a time when we felt most in pain, when we went a particularly long time without sleeping or eating. And that's what many of the most exploited people in our society feel constantly, especially people who've been harmed by the medical system, which I'm particularly interested in. Which brings me to the point that Michael made about the enemy. I think certainly there's probably examples of Serve the People programs that don't clearly identify the enemy, as there are examples of any tactic that aren't conducted well. But of course, that is exactly what Serve the People program should be doing. In the case of the program that we're going to be starting at New York City Socialist Feminists, there is no way to more bring the fight to the insurance companies than to help people fight the debt that they're in. And in fact, that's a big part of the reason why I want to do this, is because it is long past time we took this fight to the insurance companies. Right now, we've been taking this fight to the Republicans, we've been taking it to centrist Democrats, and again, I love yelling at Chuck Schumer. It's like my favorite hobby. But, you know, we need to take this fight to the insurance companies, because I completely agree with Michael. When we take their money and take their power, even in smaller ways, we get closer to fulfilling our objectives. And even in cases that are not so obvious, we're going to use the example of the Black Panthers free breakfast program. You know, Fred Hampton talked about this extensively. I highly recommend. You can find great stuff nowadays on like YouTube of Fred Hampton doing his speeches. You know, Fred Hampton said that, you know, people can't fight when they're preoccupied with their empty stomachs. And I very much think that is the case. You know, if we want people to clearly identify an enemy, let's feed them so they can actually hear us when we say who that enemy is.
Okay, so I think Michael's question ties into the point I made about one argument for Serve the People projects, which is that it allows us to make contact with, build trust with working class communities, and then recruit them and mobilize them. And I have a couple points that I think speak against this. So the first point is, at least in DSA, making contact with working class communities is not an issue, right? We've canvassed in neighborhoods throughout the city. Any major campaign gives us a great excuse to do so. We've done so on the New York Health Act, the Right to Know Act, our electoral campaigns, the Bedford Union Armory. I'm sure we'll do more in the future. Right? We've shown that we're competent and we're capable. We can get out there with some clipboards and knock some doors. I also think that we can make more contact with people through mass organizing than we can with Serve the People programs. We can talk about that later. The second point is, when we make contact with people, potential members, we want the first impression we make to be explicitly political, right? That healthcare is a human right, that we need to tax the millionaires, the billionaire class, etc. Building a public presence around service makes it less clear exactly what we believe and what we're working towards. So I think we should lead with clear, concise political messaging that speaks to the interests of working class people. The third point is that the argument is often made that by providing a good or service, people will have a positive view of us, of our organization, and be more likely to join DSA. But I think there's actually not a ton of evidence that this works, or at least that it works in our organization. There's no inherent connection between doing admirable work for people and having a political message that resonates with them. And providing services as the first point of contact creates a relationship from the get-go of service provider to client. And it's not very easy to change this dynamic, right, to turn clients into political actors. I think that attempts to do so can feel futile or manipulative on the part of the organizer. Fourth thing is that on this question of trust, people have always organized for shared material gain, not only without trust, but in the face of tremendous animosity and hate towards each other. So the Congress of Industrial Organizations famously organized multiracial unions in the Deep South in the 1930s, despite the immense social segregation of Jim Crow, because both black and white workers made a judgment that a labor union benefited both of them. And one point I want to emphasize is that in politics, I think trust is a byproduct of struggle, not a prerequisite for it. So I think we build trust in the struggle. Now, we can still make targeted strategic outreach to community organizations and leaders with the goal of building relationships, but I think it should be primarily political. Fifth, if we want to develop relationships with communities that we seek to organize, there are lots of good ways to do that, right? These communities already have their own service organizations. It's perfectly fine to go help out in a food bank, build a community garden, be a court supporter. I think that's good, meaningful work. I don't want to denigrate it in any way. But I think it's different than mass organizing. And for that reason, I think we should be really cautious about putting our limited organizational resources behind it. Last point I want to make is that, on this question, is that the mass socialist parties and movements of the 20th century achieved their scale and their political power through three main areas of activity: election campaigns, labor movement, and an independent press. This is what allowed them to gain a broad audience, and then that mass base was then supplemented with social and cultural activities and mutual aid projects. I think that's a really key point, that the base was built first through mass organizing. And then once people actually had a sense of shared interest and shared struggle, those mutual aid projects truly were mutual. I think DSA going into communities with the idea of serving the people actually doesn't look a lot like mutual aid and looks more like charity. You want to respond?
Yeah.
So I want to highlight a question on which there seems to be some consensus actually between you two, that that it's vital whatever we do, whatever campaign we engage in, to identify the enemy. So as socialists, of course, we believe that the state should provide basic services for people and ensure that they have enough to eat and are not in medical debt and so forth. And we would always want to engage in campaigns that highlight rather than seeking to supplement the gaps in the social welfare state. It strikes me that different types of serve the people campaigns do this in very varying ways, identify the enemy and seek power. And Emma, for instance, has her proposal to actually go after the debt collection of medical insurance companies does this better, whereas providing food for people, for instance, might easily fail to highlight the gaps in the state and might simply merely highlight that the people providing the food are good rather than that the people in power who are stealing all the food are bad. I guess my question here is what characteristics should we look for in effective serve the people campaigns, and how easier are they to find? What makes an effective one?
So one thing about the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program, as I mentioned, what was so innovative about that program was that it was made at a time while there was a gap in that particular need. And then the federal program happened in 1975, and food pantries expanded massively around that time as well. Other forms of food social welfare, both provided by the government and private charity organizations. So, you know, in our current situation, providing food might not be such a good idea. I think in most places in the United States, outside of maybe some places around the border between the US and Mexico. Now, in terms of what makes for good serve the people projects. It depends largely on the local circumstances that you're dealing with. For example, the North Texas branch of DSA did this amazing flu shot program where they provided people with flu shots as a way to advocate for Medicare for all. It was a great program. It was a really creative idea. I don't think, and you know, I actually heard some people in New York City express interest in it, and you know, I said, well, do you know where to get a free flu shot in New York City? And they were like, well, yeah, there's like, you know, these different, and I'm like, well, then it's probably not a good idea, because we need to find the gaps in the social welfare if we want to use this as a political tool rather than, again, supplementing or simply just kind of mitigating the harms of capitalism. And that's why certain things like this medical debt program are so great, because there's never going to be a time, as long as capitalism exists and until we get single payer, as long as we have a for-profit health insurance system, there will always be medical debt. This will always be a way that we can say to people, this is a system that harms you, we're going to help you fight this today, and then you're going to work with us to help end this once and for all.
Okay, so the question of what's an ideal serve the people project. So I'm critical of them, but I think even if we were to do them, there'd be 3 or 4 criteria that I would want to identify. So the first is, I think they should be directly connected to an organizing campaign with a political demand, but clearly playing a supplemental rather than a central role. I actually think that's something that Emma and I agree on, though maybe we disagree on the degree to which it should be central or supportive. The second thing is, it should be of low cost to the organization in terms of time and money. DSA is still a relatively small organization in the grand scheme of things, and so for that sense, I think we need to be really careful with how we spend our time and money. The third is that these projects, I think, should have the ability for us to connect people to organizations with more experience and resources than we have. And tied to that is that I'd like to connect people to resources that give them a recurring service, so signing up for food stamps, Medicaid, supplemental security income, or disability checks. Those would be the 3 or 4 things that I would want to see in a Serve the People project, if we decided to do them. Now, on the question of historical models, I think we should talk about the Panthers, because that is what most people talk about when they talk about Serve the People, and it's come up tonight. So I think that whatever we think of the Panthers, we should first acknowledge that this was 50 years ago. It was a different time in a different political context, right? And so, just like the Panthers made their own decisions about what was most strategic at that time, we should make similar questions about what is most strategic at our time based on our collective political analysis. Now, I think the biggest difference about the Panthers that not enough people talk about is that if you look around this room, we don't quite look like the Panthers, right? So, the early breakfast program, which at its height served 20,000 meals a day across the country, was Panthers who were of that community. They had organic connections to working class people in the communities they were serving. If DSA launches the Serve the People project now, overwhelmingly, it's not going to have that dynamic. And I think that's really important. One other thing is, I actually think people overestimate the role of the breakfast program in recruiting people to the Panthers and underestimate the political vision that they had. You know, there were lots of other organizations serving breakfast to kids in Oakland in the late 60s. I think people joined because, yes, they had connections to these people, but also the Panthers had a really well-defined political vision. You know, they had a 10-point program. They also had a newspaper that reached 250,000 people. So similar, you know, there's actually a really interesting story in Ta-Nehisi Coates' first book. His dad was the leader, at one point the leader of the Panthers in Baltimore. And you know, the Panthers decided to launch the early breakfast program in 1968. But they also decided to close a lot of their breakfast programs in 1972 because they wanted to fund Bobby Seale's mayoral campaign. He eventually lost it badly, but that was the decision they made, right? And because funding a mayoral campaign costed a ton of resources, they made the decision that they needed to close breakfast programs. So Ta-Nehisi Coates' father flew to Oakland to challenge the decision in front of the national leadership, and he was basically dismissed. So I guess the lesson there is like, the Panthers made decisions about what was most strategic to build the power of the organization and the power of the working class based on the political and economic dynamics of that moment. And I think in that sense, we should replicate the Panthers, right? Like, our strategic decisions should flow from our analysis of the current moment. And I think that's really important, so I'll end there.
Just one quick response. I do think the scarcity issue is a really important one, so we get to that later. And then in terms of the point about connecting to other organizations, I think we see kind of a contradiction in Michael's argument here, which is that he doesn't support us doing this work because it's not explicitly political, but then we're going to do this work through organizations which oftentimes don't allow us to do it in explicitly political ways. I think that's exactly what we need to do, serve the people programs. I don't know if anyone else here has done legal services. A lot of legal services, for example, are prohibited because of their LSC funding from doing anything political. And there are many organizations that are simply part of the nonprofit industrial complex and don't want to deal with socialists. And in terms of signing people up for reoccurring services, that was an interesting idea and was one that we really liked. Unfortunately, with a lot of like government programs, for example, you need like licenses and such in order to be patient navigators, for example, or to sign people up for programs like Medicare and Medicaid. So good idea, unfortunately not one that we can put into practice, at least here in New York.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
So one clarifying point. What I meant was that we should connect people to the organizations that do have the licensing and the resources to do those signups. So I don't think we should be signing. I wasn't suggesting that we should be signing people up for Medicaid at the door. I'm sorry, the first point. Oh, nonprofits. So the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, nonprofits can do a lot, right? They have oftentimes multi-million-dollar budgets. They have dozens of staff with decades of experience. There's some things that they're very, very good at, right? Providing legal services is one example. There are many others. But Em's right. They often can't do that in a political way. And so I guess what I'm saying is, well, first, the flip side to that is that we can do things that they can't do, right? So even though we don't have as much money and we don't have as much time and resources, we're member funded. So we can often take political positions that they can't, right? We can name the enemy and call them out in a way that they can't because oftentimes the enemy is funding them. So I think what I want to propose is that we focus on the explicitly political work, right? Naming the enemy systematically as capitalism and then individuals and institutions that benefit from it. And then also making political demands to address that. So we as a political socialist organization should do what I think we are best suited to do. And organizations or nonprofits that have lots of staff and lots of resources should do what they're best situated to do.
Do I have time for one more question before we move to Q&A?
Yeah.
All right. So, final question here. So, my expectation is that since we're a big tent organization that so far in this chapter has very rarely prevented anyone from doing anything they're willing to put in the time and energy to organize, that some of us will do serve the people, and that this will be an ongoing conversation as that project develops. My question is, how will we tell if it's working? What does it look like to work? And how will we tell if it's failing and we should throw in the towel and rethink it? I think that for every project we engage in this year, I think having in mind what it looks like to fail is very important.
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is sort of the source of one of my biggest reservations about sort of the people projects is I think those metrics are really hard to develop. You know, in say the Bedford Union campaign, Bedford Union Armory campaign, the ultimate goal would have been affordable housing and community land trust, right? And we didn't win that, but that metric was really clear. Even though some might say we lost, we still got much higher rates of affordability at the project. So I think that's something that's really quantifiable, and it's really important that it's quantifiable. Same thing would go for our electoral campaigns, right? We can quantify the number of people that whose doors we knocked. We can quantify the number of people that we targeted, right? And we're keeping all of that information. So I think those are campaigns that, in addition to having really clear political demands, also have clear metrics, or you could say maybe a spectrum of metrics for success or failure. So this is a big question I have is, you know, for something like fixing brake lights, say, which I think is less relevant in New York, but just for an example, what would success look like? Or if we set up a tutoring program after school, what would success look like? Now, I have a sense that one might say, oh, well, it's recruiting people to the organization, but I'd want to know specifically how we're looking at that. Another question I have to this end is, you know, let's say that we set up a tutoring program, and it's costing us a lot of time. We have to rent space, we have to get materials, and a lot of people power, right? It takes a lot of time to tutor students. Now, let's say we set that up, and it was really effective in the sense that people were turning out, right? So we were tutoring a lot of students, and we were plugging a lot of people in. But it was costing us a lot of time and resources, and we weren't recruiting, we weren't really mobilizing the people that were receiving these services. What would we do in that case, right? So would we be willing to continue that service is a big question I have. And if we were willing to continue the service, how would that be different in any meaningful way than a charity organization? Now, once that expectation of a service has been generated in a community, we need to think about how we're going to respond to the pressure to continue to provide that service, especially given the high financial cost of some of these types of programs. I predict that it'll increase the tendency to fundraise and limit our ability to do mass organizing. I think a lot of people underestimate how hard it is and expensive it is to provide quality services over an extended period of time. And I think this is actually relevant to the Panthers as well. You know, they were putting massive amounts of money into the free breakfast program. Like I said, 20,000 students a day at its height. Each kitchen had to have a requirement of 10 staff people, was the guideline set by the national organization. And you know, they were constantly fundraising in order to be able to put this program on. A lot of the times they were fundraising from very wealthy, liberal, or progressive white people. So, you know, there was one element of the Panthers in which they were very plugged into the community. There was another element of the Panthers in which they were fundraising from wealthy people to be able to do it. So I think that's another relevant consideration.
So I'm a Marxist, which means that, I know, shocking. And one of the most important parts about being a Marxist is being a historical materialist. We look at history in order to tell what is effective, and we quantify things empirically. We all know that data itself is not necessarily empirical, as the Hillary Clinton campaign pretty excessively showed. So, you know, I do canvassing with the New York City Socialist Feminists for the New York Health Act. We have people sign petitions and we tell them about the New York Health Act and to call their senator, et cetera, et cetera. How many people here have like canvassed for either the New York Health Act or for some other kind of legislation, candidate, whatever? All right, cool. Thank you so much for your service. Now, how many people here have ever left a person they've canvassed thinking, I have no idea how this person feels about this issue or my candidate or whatever? Yeah, it's a huge problem with the New York City Socialist Feminists, in addition to what I think is a problem the see with this kind of canvassing, where a lot of people think we're trying to sell something. And the one really convenient thing about giving people stuff is they don't think you're trying to sell them something when you're giving them stuff, which unfortunately a lot of finance companies take advantage of, though. That's a talk for another time. In terms of what the metrics would be for a Serve the People program, I think they're actually pretty easy to do. You serve the people, you get their contact information and names, and then you see if they join the organization. Of course, there is the possibility that they may join the organization for some sort of other reason, but it gives you a pretty good idea of whether or not these things are working. And then there's raw membership numbers, and then there's also leadership. So particularly for this idea of the medical debt project, seeing if we can get people who were recruited through this service we're providing to take leadership roles within the New York Health Act campaign, whether those are sort of official roles or things like speaking at a city council hearing, or going up with us to Albany for lobby day, things like that. And to be clear, I'm not against the sort of canvassing that we're already doing in New York City socialist feminists, because there are times where, I ran into this guy who was a teacher, and he had lived in Canada, and he was so excited. He was like, I didn't realize this was like a thing that was happening here, and he signed up, and I think he joined DSA, I'm not entirely sure of that. But it gets back to the problem I opened with in my opening talk. He was already a socialist. He was already down. And so it's great that we found him and we told him this was a thing and got him activated. But that's only going to work on a smaller portion of people, liberal progressives and socialists. And as I said before, the problem, as we see with elections, is that so many people are apathetic or just don't know how to plug into politics. And that's something that mutual aid can help us do, is solve that problem.
No, it's okay.
So do we want to do closing statements and then Q&A, or Q&A and then closing statements?
Closing statement.
And then Q&A. Okay. Back to you.
That's it. Okay, so I guess I'm just going to try to reiterate the 3 points that I made at the beginning, and then the 3 points that I hopefully made fairly effectively throughout. So I think whenever we talk about Serve the People projects, the jumping off point has to be the question of what's the purpose of a socialist organization, right? Why are we here? Now, I've argued that it's to develop people's political consciousness so they become active in socialist organization and to make demands for political and economic justice. I think involving large numbers of people in this type of mass action not only provides leverage for winning potential demands, but it actually allows us to speak to a broader audience both directly and through the media, right? We were the bedrock of Jabari's campaign, and we got 8,600 votes, right? That is a massive number of people. I'm not saying we single-handedly did all of that, but we did a really good chunk of it, and I think it's important to consider. On that same point, our goal shouldn't be to make a showing or to provide an alternative in the political sphere. Our goal should be to win those demands, right, in a way that redistributes wealth and power. So that's the first point. Now, I think the second is that, again, in limited specific circumstances, I think Serve the People projects can be a useful addition to an organizing campaign. But these projects shouldn't be the central element of any campaign we engage in. Because in and of themselves, they don't build a politics of class struggle. I think engaging in issue-based fights allows us to name the system capitalism and the specific individuals that are a part of it. Right? These are our enemies. One thing that I did say in the main portion that I want to emphasize is that, just to clarify that we don't have the resources in this room to provide what working class people need, right? The people that have the resources are the business elites and the political elites. And we have to make demands. We have to spend, I think, a disproportionate amount of our time making demands on those people to get services for all of working class New York and the United States, not just when we happen to be able to provide them, but when people need them all the time. And the third is that we need to critically evaluate how we use our time and resources as an organization most effectively. I agree with them on this point. And I think the most efficient use of our resources is to do this type of mass organizing that directly attacks the root of capitalist power, and if we win, builds the power of the working class that's fighting for it. Right? This type of political work allows us to engage in collective struggle, and in this process, we can ensure that the struggle be guided by a political vision of a fundamentally different society. Lastly, we can engage people in the struggle not on the basis of the services that we can provide for them, but on the basis of how we can fight together to win reforms that weaken capitalism and empower the working class.
I agree that our goal should be to win, and I'm excited actually that, as Mike said in his opening, that he's focused on what tactics will work, and I hope that when our medical debt program works, that he will support it. And now I'd really like to hear from all of you.
All right.